begin today's webinar. Monty?
Thanks, Medora. Hi, everybody. How are you all doing today? It's the 5th of our 10 webinars on home monitoring, and I will be joined again today by Chris Richmond, who joined me on the first webinar. Les Warner will be in the background, reading your questions, responding to those, and giving us some assistance as needed. So I appreciate their help today. The series, as we've talked about before, we're now in the 5th of 10 presentations. When you think about it, it's 10 webinars are the equivalent of 3 training days. So we're just about halfway into a 3-day training spread out over 5 weeks. What is new this week is that we're shifting into the activity tracks. We'll be doing on Tuesdays the homeowner activity track, starting today with homebuyer development. And then the next 2 Tuesdays we'll go into homebuyer assistance, or DPA, down payment assistance, and then homeowner rehabilitation. Thursdays in these 3 weeks will focus on rental activities. First, rental development this Thursday, and then in the subsequent weeks we will cover tenant-based rental assistance, which is TBRA, and long-term rental compliance to wrap up the series. So I appreciate the commitment that you've made to be with us through this. I know it's a lot to go through, and I also recognize that it's not possible for us to go into all the regulatory details. This webinar is really about introducing you to the monitoring exhibits that HUD staff use to monitor your programs, and to talk to you about how you can do a better job of monitoring your own programs. Our objectives today is to introduce you to the monitoring guide, Exhibit 7-27. As you will recall, all of the home monitoring exhibits are in Chapter 7 of the CPD Monitoring Handbook, and Exhibit 727 is the homebuyer development exhibit. So we'll introduce you to that. We'll talk about the policies and procedures that you need to ensure compliance with the homebuyer development activities that you undertake or your partners undertake. We'll talk about, as usual, the program design considerations, which are things that go beyond the regulations into best practices and additional things that you can think about to improve the performance of your program. And then we'll end up with recommending steps to prepare for the HUD monitoring by doing a PJ self-assessment. And we'll also talk about some of the tools and resources, just as we have in the previous sessions. Before I launch into today, I want to distinguish between what I'm covering today and what we'll cover next Tuesday. Homebuyer development and down payment assistance to homebuyers are activities that, even though they both are homebuyer activities, they are different in their structure and nature. The homebuyer development projects that we'll talk about today, project focused on development of housing, while down payment assistance or homebuyer assistance is a program activity, really, oftentimes run by your sub-recipients, and it's just providing financing to home buyers, but not necessarily development. I'd made the decision with the monitoring handbook revisions in 2019 to split these two out rather than to try to cover both of them in one exhibit, because it was very confusing. Some of you may do home buyer development projects through your CHODOs or nonprofits or for-profit developers, and some of you may be doing just straight down payment assistance or home buyer second mortgage lending without development, or some of you may be doing both. If you're doing both, you'd want to cover both of these webinars today and next Tuesday. Or if you're just doing one of those two, as I've mentioned, you might not have to sit through both of them. I hope that gives you a little bit of sense of clarity of how we distinguish between those two activities. Let me go into an overview. Excuse me. Let me go into an overview of the regulatory requirements that pertain to home buyer development. Our touchstone for home buyer activities in the home rule is in 92-254. Now again, for those of you who may be relatively new, whatever you see in 92, that's something I'm talking about, a home rule. That is Book 24 of the Code of Federal Regulations, CFR, and Part 92 is the home rule. And that's the most frequent reference you will see will be to a section in 92-254. I might also mention, before I get too deep into this, some of the other acronyms I'll be using for those of you who are relatively new to home. When I say PJ, I mean the participating jurisdiction, the state or local government that receives the funds directly from HUD and administers the home activities in their jurisdiction. I'll use the phrase CHODO again. We covered them last week, but it's the community housing development organizations that have special access to a set aside of funds. I'll be using acronyms like LI for low income. I'll be using CPD for the Office of Community Planning and Development, which is the office of HUD within which home sits. And we'll be talking about CPD notices. And I will also mention the one other rule that will get mentioned at points in this webinar and others in this series is 2 CFR Part 200, which is the Uniform Administrative Requirements for federal grants. And it used to be the OMB circulars. They've now been consolidated into 2 CFR. If you see 200, that's something I'm referring to the standard or uniform federal grant management or administration requirements. So for Homebuyer, 92-254 is the main section of the rule. If you're just doing homebuyer activities, that's a good place to start to learn them. There's the basic requirements are covered in 92-254A, but then there are other useful things in that section of the rule. The definition of home ownership, for example, is in 254C, and the requirement for homebuyer program policies, which do affect you in this webinar and also will be covered in next week's webinar on down payment assistance. The homebuyer program policies are required when you do homebuyer activities to make sure that you are doing a good job of selecting, underwriting, and assisting homebuyers with housing and assistance that is feasible for at least the period of affordability. In addition to that, there's some other sections of the rule that are important to you that includes the income determinations, eligible and ineligible costs, which we'll talk about, income targeting, subsidy limits and underwriting and subsidy layering, which I will get into in just a few minutes, and the property standards. There are some additional program administrative requirements that run to the PJ in overseeing these activities, and you see them listed there, the 92-502 through 508 sections that go into things that you're required to manage an activity. The one unique thing to Homebuyer that's listed under program administrative requirements is 92-254E, as you see in this particular slide. That one is there if you happen to deliver down payment assistance to homebuyers through a third-party lender, and there's some special requirements there. We won't spend time on that today as much as we will next time, but I wanted to alert you that it was there. Sorry. The exhibit itself, as I've mentioned, is 720-27. You see it's on the screen there. This is a rather lengthy monitoring exhibit. It's one of the longest in the whole series. There's like 104 questions in 18 different topics in this, or program areas in this particular exhibit. And while we will cover the entire exhibit, we've regrouped and reorganized the questions in a flow that reflects your processing of the project and also to be able to fit the whole exhibit into a 2-hour webinar. By the way, if these sections, if we get into a section where I'm talking about a specific exhibit question, I want to alert you that I'm trying to circle there in yellow. It's not showing up very well, but the exhibit question is in the upper right-hand corner of the slide, as we've done in the previous sessions. As I mentioned, with 104 questions and 18 topics, we couldn't really cover them one by one going through in a webinar such as this, so we had to group those 18 topics further into 4 major topics that you see there. I'll talk first about project requirements, and then I'll talk about underwriting and finance of the project. Chris will talk about buyer qualification and financing and administration and monitoring requirements. And then she'll also launch into the program design considerations. You can see some of the subtopics there, but that's sort of the flow of the presentation today. With that, we want to make certain that we've got a sense of the range of people that are in the class. So Medora, if you can post this first poll and ask people to respond. I see it's come up already. And if you could pick the answer that applies to you and hit the submit button down in the lower right, we'll do a quick poll to get a sense of the amount of experience we have in the audience today. While that's being tabulated, I'll remind you again that this webinar is, although it's about monitoring and documentation required to demonstrate that you've properly monitored for compliance, we do encourage you to ask your questions via the Q&A box. And Les is watching it and Chris is watching it while I'm talking, and we'll get a sense of what your questions are. We may not be able to go into all the details here, and there are a lot of people on this poll, so I'm sure that we'll get to as many as we can. But as I see in the results here, we've got a pretty good distribution, and we have nearly a quarter of you with less than 1 year experience in home buyer development. So please feel free, if you don't follow everything or understand everything that we are talking about, to raise your questions, and we'll decide what we can get into in this session. And I will also then make certain that we convey the questions that were asked to HUD, and so that they get a sense of what the training needs are. With that, I'm going to go into the discussion of the topic areas that I just mentioned that are related to the monitoring exhibits. Those of you who've sat through the first 4 sessions know this sort of color coding approach we take and the organization that we take to the topic areas. We first discuss the regulatory requirements with the heading requirements in this burnt orange. We then talk about the documentation that's required, and that's the green color that you see there. If it's more than just documentation, if there's a judgment that has to be made regarding a particular question or topic, there will also be a blue section, a blue heading called Compliance Review, where we'll talk about the determinations that HUD makes beyond documentation. There won't be a compliance review section in each of the topics that we take up. It's only when it's necessary that we'll have that. As I mentioned, we're breaking it into these 4 topics, and the first one that I'm going to start with is project requirements. This collects a number of things that the project is required, homebuyer project is required to be, that doesn't fit into any of the other topics as, say, a financing issue or a buyer financing issue or things of that nature. So the first one that I want to talk about in terms of project requirements is the issue of what units are eligible. And there's a couple of requirements that come into play here. There's the requirement that home buyer assistance be for single-family housing. Most of you who've worked with HUD know that HUD defines single-family to be generally to be 1 to 4 units. So it's not just about a true single-family, but it could be a duplex or a triple-decker or a quadplex that is owner-occupied as well. It can also be a condo or a cooperative unit. Manufactured housing is permissible, and other forms of ownership would have to be recognized as ownership under your state and approved by HUD. I assume most of you are dealing with only those types of housing you see listed on the screen. A second requirement is that there is a limit on sales prices. The statute said that it was the intention of the Congress to assist housing of modest means, and that it defined it as 95% of the median value of homes sold in the market in the last year. HUD implements that through a homeownership value limit that it publishes on the HUD exchange every year as it gets its allocation of funds. I will remind you that there are in fact now 2 limits for each of your jurisdictions, for each of those 1 through 4 unit sizes, one for existing housing and the other for new construction. The next requirement is that it be sold to an eligible buyer, an eligible low-income buyer, and the rule requires that it be purchased or under a ratified sales agreement within 9 months of completion of construction, or it must be converted to rental or the funds to be repaid. So there is a risk to developing without having a ready buyer, and there's a time limit to get it under agreement once the construction is completed. Because the truth is, until you have a unit occupied by a low-income household, nobody's really been assisted in the program. And then, of course, there's environmental compliance. A lot of single-family actions are not subject to NEPA, and so can be done under the categorically excluded category, and some that are just pure down payment assistance aren't even subject to some of the 58.5 requirements and can be done with just flood insurance and a couple of other things that are in 58.6. But you do have to have each property cleared or project cleared before you commit and expend the funds for those projects. So what would be the documentation that's required to prove you have eligible units? Well, it really comes down to 2 things, possibly 3 things, and obviously one is the environmental review record that shows that you've completed the appropriate checklist and the project has been cleared. And then you have to have the documentation as to that the property has gone under agreement within time and it's single family and it meets the price limit, and that usually is in the sales agreement or equivalent documentation, although sometimes you need other things like title reports and so forth to document the type of housing that it is. But between all those various documents, you are supporting those 4 requirements that I've listed up above, and they should be in the file and available for inspection. The second requirement that I need to talk about is property standards, but we're not going to talk about them a lot today because there's a lot of detail and it depends upon the type of activity that's being done. I'll draw your attention to one of the links up above. If you go the tab over 2 from the slide link or tab that you have now, you'll see this particular exhibit, the Property Standards for Home Assisted Housing, which is a generic overview of the property standards requirements in 92-251. What will apply to you, you can also download those from the website where you signed up for this session. What I need to point out is that what the requirements that apply will depend upon whether you're doing new construction or rehabilitation. New construction is generally subject to state and local codes and also disaster mitigation where that's required, while rehabilitation focuses on your own PJ rental or written rehab standards, and those standards have to disclose what kinds of improvements you will do, what health and safety or life-threatening deficiencies need to be addressed as a priority, 5-year useful life on building structures and systems, and if the property happens to be a pre-78 unit, the lead-based paint requirements. In particular, in 24 CFR Part 35, in particular 35-900 to 935 is the section on rehabilitation that you would have to meet. You also then may have, if you're doing any manufactured housing, there are different HUD manufactured housing standards that are listed in 92-251 that you'll have to comply with as well. So the standards do vary. I'll refer you again to that handout that I showed you a moment ago. And please look those up because we don't have time to go into the details today on those property standards. The other thing that the property standards require is PJ inspections. The inspections fall into three categories potentially. If you're doing rehabilitation, there's a requirement for an initial inspection, which is used to determine what deficiencies need to be corrected and what improvements need to be made to bring the property up to home property standards. Then there are progress inspections during the work to verify that the work's being done according to the contract, and a final inspection, which is critical to document that the property, when completed, meets all home property standards as required by the rule. And those inspections are really very important. You'll see under the documentation that inspection records are listed there, and I urge you to make certain that all the inspection records are there and that the inspection reports are signed and dated to show that you did have compliance. In addition to that, you're going to need the scope of work and the contract documents that supported those improvements. And if it's rehab, you also want to have your written rehab standards handy in case HUD needs to review those to determine if the work was done in compliance with your own rehab standards. This is one of the cornerstone issues in the home program, is to have properties that are decent, safe, and that are improved to last for at least a period of affordability. So please make sure you've done that. You'll notice in the upper right, there's a bunch of questions that run to property standards. It depends on which category of improvements we fall into, but it gets a lot of attention in the HUD monitoring, and you need to make certain you're ready for that and have the appropriate documentation. Ownership and occupancy, the key thing is it has to meet the definition of home ownership in 92.2, which basically focuses on fee simple title for most situations, but it might also bring into play ground lease issues if you're working with a community land trust or if you're working with Native American or tribal properties, and some other situations where there might be a long-term ground lease. Refer to the ownership definition in 92.2 to make sure any ground leases meet that. Otherwise, it would be fee simple title. And obviously, you would want to document that that is through your title policy, long-term lease, the co-op membership agreement, whatever it is that documents that the form of ownership is eligible. And if you fall outside of that definition, you have to make sure the form of ownership is approved by HUD. Lease purchase is not a common thing these days. It used to be a more frequent use, but with the low cost of financing these days, it's become less popular, but it is permissible under the home rule. You can assist home buyers through lease purchase, and you see the major requirements there is that income eligibility is determined at the time the lease is executed, not later when the sale is ultimately consummated at the end of the lease period. The purchase must be completed within 36 months from the date of the original lease agreement. And if it's not within 42 months, if it's not sold, it has to be converted to rental or the funds need to be repaid. So if you have been running a lease purchase program, you're going to have the documentation that supports that you've met those requirements. That would include that the activity is approved in your action plan because it has to be specified as an activity that you would use. There has to be a lease purchase policy that you have and you followed. In addition, there would have to be the original lease purchase agreement with the lease purchaser and any records that pertain to the transfer of the property to that home buyer or the conversion to rental within the time frames that I listed above. The other requirement that I want to talk about up front is affirmative marketing. Most of you know that affirmative marketing does apply to both programs and to projects of 5 or more units. The affirmative marketing procedures are procedures that the PJ is supposed to have and imposes upon its projects. You also should bear in mind that the affirmative marketing procedures, you have to have not only those procedures, but you have to have ways of documenting what has been done and also evaluating what's been done. When HUD comes on site, they will use not only this particular exhibit, but they'll also use Exhibit 22-3, which gets into some of the fair housing and civil rights issues. So I'll use that extra exhibit to monitor your affirmative marketing. What I'm going to refer you to is Homebuyers Volume 14, number 1, for more guidance on having the procedures that list the things that you need to have for your affirmative marketing procedures, and it would be useful for you to make certain that what you have stands up to those particular standards as expressed in Homebuyers 14.1. In addition to those procedures, then you'd want to have records that show that you've implemented the affirmative marketing procedures. That would include all the evidence and documentation of all the outreach and activities that were conducted as a part of it. But it will also go into you evaluating the outcome of those procedures and whether they need to be modified going forward. With that, I'm going to turn into a little more detailed topic on underwriting and financing. And again, we're talking about homebuyer projects here, so we're talking about looking at the overall project as presented to us and proposed by a developer of the housing. We're not yet, the next section will get into buyer financing issues. This is only about project financing issues. We go back to this touchstone issue, which is that the rule requires us to invest no more home funds than are necessary to ensure that we provide quality, affordable housing that is financially viable for at least the affordability period. That's our overarching requirement. And it runs through everything I'm going to talk about in this section. That'll include issues relating to eligible cost, underwriting, cost allocation, to subsidy layering, and all of those things will come together in your project underwriting policies. It's hard to talk about these things in linear fashion because they're really parallel or interrelated issues, but they all sort of wrap under this topic of underwriting and making the determination of the appropriate amount of home assistance to provide. That's going to be the focus of this particular segment of the webinar. I'll be focusing mostly on the project budget and the amount of home funds that are being provided to project costs and for the development of the units. Now, I have to acknowledge here that there are really 2 ways that home buyers are assisted, and some of this is what I tend to call pass-through assistance, where you as a PJ provide the home funds to the developer. They use those funds for the development costs of the project, and when they sell to the buyer, they can adjust the requirements for the buyer funding and cover some of the costs the buyer can't cover through their own purchase with home subsidy that you would use during the development phase. In essence, you're passing through the assistance from the developer to the home buyer. That's one way a buyer can be financed, but in addition, there can be direct home buyer assistance that comes in at the tail end. Sometimes additional assistance when a lower income person comes in and the original development assistance wasn't adequate. The amount of assistance a buyer needs, whether it comes through pass-through assistance or whether it comes through additional direct financing at the time of the sale, must be determined based on the prices and the buyer income. for project financing purposes, you are usually projecting an expected buyer income level and an expected need for assistance, but that can vary based on the actual income of the buyers when they are selected at the end of the process. For this reason, HUD has the requirement in 92254F for homebuyer program policies, and that includes the need for buyer underwriting guidelines, for responsible lending policies, which basically talk about or indicate what's a satisfactory first mortgage to be in front of the home financing, and also the refinancing and resubordination policies when somebody down the road wants to refinance their first mortgage and comes to you for subordination of the home financing to that new mortgage. All those things are in the requirements for homebuyer policies. Let me go down through the issues that I've raised, some of the things that I've mentioned one by one, and then we'll come back around to this ultimate conclusion in the underwriting of how much assistance to deliver. The first thing is eligible and reasonable costs. The requirements, primarily we're talking about the eligible costs that are listed in 92206, which provide for those development costs which are eligible for the use of home funds. They tend to fall into the categories of acquisition, site improvements, infrastructure connections, eligible soft costs, and developer fees. Those are listed in 92206, and obviously these are items in a development budget. Home funds can be paid for those eligible costs. The one that I want to call out here with a little extra attention, and it gets a separate question in the monitoring exhibit, is the 24-month limit that HUD has put on architectural engineering related professional services costs that are required to develop the plans and specs and the work write-ups. They can only have been incurred up to 24 months before the commitment. Obviously, some development of those plans and specs are needed in order to budget the project and to determine how much assistance is needed. But we don't want to go back too far, and so HUD has put a 24-month limit on that. Please make certain that if you are paying for any pre-commitment costs that you adhere to that limit. The ineligible costs are defined in 92214, and they run to some costs that can't be paid with home funds, but also fees that cannot be charged to participants, and we'd urge you to pay attention to those. The fees limitations were added in 2013, and you don't want to have your home buyers being charged for things that home has paid for or doesn't permit to be paid for. Underlying all this, again, is the Uniform Administrative Requirements for Federal Grants, 2 CFR Part 200. And one part in particular are the cost principles. And one of the cost principles, introduced those a few sessions ago. One of the cost principles is that all costs must be reasonable in addition to being eligible. I give you the reference there of the discussion of reasonable, but essentially the requirement is that you as a PJ need to look at all costs within a budget and determine those costs to be reasonable based on some kind of cost estimating, market pricing, competitive bidding, or other ways that you do to determine that the costs are reasonable in your current market situation. So the documentation to show these is obviously you want to have the project budget sources and uses that show the costs, that show which costs home has been allocated to pay, that you have reviewed all those costs and determined them to be reasonable based on one of those methods that I discussed, and that there is an adequate accounting paper trail to show the source and application of all project funds, especially the home funds, that they have in fact been dispersed for eligible costs. So HUD, in looking at all this, and they will spend time looking at a few of your projects and the costs and tracing that paper trail, they'll want to reach the conclusion that all the costs paid for with home funds were home eligible, and that all the costs were determined to be reasonable by the PJ. And again, that caution about costs incurred prior to commitment have to meet the requirements of the rule, especially there, as a separate question. The second thing then is to go into subsidy limits and cost allocations. Subsidy limits there are two that we need to talk about. Assisted units are subject to a minimum of $1,000 per unit, per assisted unit, and of home funds, and a maximum subsidy limit as is published by HUD or as is determined annually based upon HUD guidelines. There is guidance at the HUD exchange about how to contact your field office to get them to confirm the limits that apply to you, because they are calculated based upon program limits of another HUD program. And so they're not published in quite the same manner as the other limits that I've talked about, like the value limits. But you do want to determine those annually. I should mention that these limits apply to the home funds put into the project, not the total cost of the project. These are restrictions only on the total amount of home funds that are used. In addition to those subsidy limits, there is a requirement that you need to determine the eligible costs that are allocable to the assisted units. In many homebuyer projects, 100% of the costs are going into all low-income homebuyer units, and so the cost allocation issue is not as challenging as it might be in a rental situation. But if you happen to have less than 100% of the units home assisted, or there are some non-residential costs and some ineligible costs, the cost allocation procedures need to be followed to make a determination of how much home dollars can be put into the assisted projects. We can't go into cost allocation today, but I will urge you to take a look at CPD Notice 1615. Again, CPD Notice 1615. And also there is a home cost allocation tool available on the HUD exchange. Just type in a search for home cost allocation tool and you will get to it. And it gives you some spreadsheets that you can use to do cost allocation should it become necessary. So the documentation here is that you have a development budget that identifies the sources and uses, that identifies the home dollars and can determine that the home dollars are within the maximum subsidy limits. The written agreement needs to specify the assisted units as well. And if there's any reason that you have to allocate home funds across eligible and ineligible units and eligible uses and ineligible costs, you must have a copy of your cost allocation as well in the file to show that you've made a determination. The bottom line of all this is that only eligible costs were allocated to home units, and if the costs are prorated, that the units were determined and the proration done according to the guidance provided in CPD 1615 on comparable units. I'm not going to go into that topic, but just bear in mind that if you do need to do the cost allocation, you need to follow the guidance and make certain that you've documented that in your file. The next thing that I want to talk about and build on, I already introduced the notion of minimum and maximum subsidies in the last slide, but I also want to come back to this other issue of that not only are you supposed to be within those program limits, but you want to invest no more than is necessary for project viability and for reasonable return to the developer. And you want to make sure the form of investment is eligible. And the documentation for those would be obviously the underwriting subsidy layering analysis, which I'll talk about next, the cost allocation, the written agreements, and legal documents that indicate the amount and form of the home subsidy. The eligible forms of investment are quite broad. Under the home rule, 92205D identifies a whole range of things that you can do, including investing those funds as equity contributions, doing interest-bearing loans, no interest loans, deferred loans, grants, other kinds of investments that have been approved by HUD. Just make certain that the form of investment you're doing is one of those that's permissible under 92205, or that you have gotten HUD approval of the form of investment you're going to use through your consolidated plan annual plan submission. I saved the underwriting slide for last because to me, in this section, because to me this is where everything comes together. And maybe that's my bias as somebody who's been trained in underwriting, but it is to me the one place where you draw all these issues together to make certain that you can determine the amount of assistance that's needed by the project. The requirement is that you must underwrite the project, and it's in 92250B is the section of the rule that tells you what the underwriting should be. You're supposed to have underwriting guidelines, and your underwriting procedure should look at sources and uses to make sure the costs are reasonable, as we've discussed, but also that all other sources are firmly committed, because we don't want to commit to a project until we know that project is ready to go forward. You also need to look at market demand to make sure it's sufficient to absorb the units within the time deadlines that the program implements. You want to look at developer experience and their financial capacity to develop and make sure they're adequate for the project that they're undertaking. All these things are coming together along with the actual determination of the amount of assistance needed. Now, the term subsidy layering in the next bullet is one of the key things that you should remember to pay attention to. If you have more than home funds going in to the project, if there's another public source of money going into the project, that triggers the statutory requirement for subsidy layering, which is another way of saying looking at the total amount of public subsidy that's being delivered to a project and determining that that amount is necessary. In other words, you can't just put blinders on and assume that you've determined that your funds are okay in there, but not paying attention to other public funds that are being invested in the project, whether they're coming from your jurisdiction or not. You need to look at all public financing together. The documentation then obviously goes into how you document the particular underwriting that you've conducted. Some of you do working papers, some of you do reports or underwriting memos. You have spreadsheets and things that attach to that to show that you've looked at all of these things. And whatever it is that you use to document should be in the file to show that you've conducted the cost review, that you've conducted the market analysis, that you've looked at developer capacity, and that you've verified that there are other funds firmly committed. And if it's other public money being put into the project, that you've looked at it in the context, the need in the context of all public funding and the role that home plays in that. All those things need to be in your file. If you've triggered subsidy layering, be sure to explicitly document that you have done that review. I would also mention that this documentation should be consistent with your underwriting policies, and the HUD staff may ask to see your underwriting policies as part of their review of your underwriting of the project. The last topic then that I want to take up is owner-developer written agreements, and then the commitment and setup of the project in IDIS. Throughout this webinar series, I've mentioned that written agreements are one of HUD's primary management tools for ensuring compliance in the home program. I've mentioned the four big ones to me are the rules, the policies and procedures, the written agreements, and IDIS and financial management systems. Between them, they make certain that we've fully documented everything that needs to be done, and they become the things that we use to enforce the program requirements. I'm going to focus on the owner-developer written agreement now. I've mentioned before that the buyers will also need written agreements, and Chris will be talking about that momentarily, and we'll also deal with that again next week. This is a little bit different than the written agreement that we discussed in last Thursday's webinar, because we were focusing then on administrative partners like state recipients and subrecipients. And they are subject to all of the broad rules that we are, including Part 200. The written agreements for owner-developers are more specifically narrowly defined because they are not administrators under the home program. They're not subject to all those federal rules unless we make them so in our agreement. So the agreements with owner-developers become critical for protecting your funds while they are using your funds to deliver the project, and protect your rights in the event that you need to get the money back from that. So what we're doing here is we're talking about a written agreement that must meet the requirements of 92-504C3. Got to identify all the terms of the home investment, all the home and project requirements that apply to the project, and have sufficient detail for PJs to monitor the requirements on as they are being implemented by the developer. Obviously, the documentation here is the written agreement and any amendments. You want to make sure that it's in the file, that it's been signed and dated by all the parties, the PJ and the developer, and it contains all those requirements that we've discussed. If you look at the upper right, look at how many questions in the monitoring exhibit apply to the written agreement. There's a lot of detail here, and we are not going to be able to cover it. It's nearly 1/4 of this monitoring exhibit goes into the provisions in the written agreement. I put this list up only for your reference and urge you to look more carefully at the requirements in 92-504C3. But what HUD's I'm not going to go into each of these things, but what HUD's going to do is they're going to go through your written agreements for the projects that they sample and make certain you have all the required provisions. And I've listed some of them here. Grouping them as the administrative provisions that are just sort of the general contract kind of provisions, and then the project-specific provisions as they may apply. Subpart F, by the way, you see in the second bullet on the right-hand column, it refers to the 92-254 stuff. Subpart F is 92-250 through 254. So it'll bring in the underwriting requirements, it'll bring in the property standards, it'll bring in all of the homebuyer project requirements that I've mentioned. Project commitment then can occur once you have an executed written agreement, executed, signed, and dated by all parties, and that it has received environmental clearance. And these following additional provisions are part of the definition of commitment in 92.2. All the necessary financing's been secured, which we determine under underwriting. A budget and schedule have been established and attached to the agreement so that it clearly identifies the total project budget, but also where the home funds have been committed for eligible costs. That the underwriting analysis is complete, as I mentioned, sources and uses, reasonable costs, market demand, the developer experience and financial capacity, and commitments of all sources. And construction is expected or scheduled to start within 12 months. If you've executed the agreement under these terms, then the project is actually ready. The documentation, obviously, in addition to the signed and dated written agreement, is the underwriting analysis that backs that up, the environmental review records that show that the project has met the requirements and has been cleared. And HUD, in looking at this, will make sure all those things are in place and that the written agreement was executed prior to your setup in IDIS once all those things were completed. With that, I'm going to ask Chris and Les if they have seen any questions come up that they would like to discuss right now.
Just to remind folks that this is a monitoring training. We've had a lot of basic questions about home and home buyer programs, and so we've referred a lot of people to the online self-paced, we call it e-building home session. So folks, if you're not super familiar with home buyer programs, that's a really good place to start. We've had a lot of questions about where do we find the subsidy limits, the maximum subsidy limits. You know, they're posted on the HUD exchange. You also want to check with your HUD field office to make sure you're using the proper subsidy limits. Not too many questions about monitoring, though, that I've seen. Les, anything you want to add right now?
I'll just note that in a number of these, I've kind of noted to people that you may have your own program limits that you have put in place that would be more restrictive. And so when you're thinking about monitoring, make sure that you're not just using the home program limits, but also keeping in mind if you've set your own program design limits that are more restrictive, you need to make sure that folks are following those.
That's a good point, Les. HUD does expect PJs to not only comply with the home rules, but also comply with their own policies. And so that if they have more restrictive requirements in terms of income levels or price limits or any of those things, they should make certain that those are also covered in their monitoring.
And they would be outlined within your written agreement also.
Yes, sir.
Right, and we're also today focusing on home buyer. There were a number of questions about homeowner rehab or owner-occupied rehab, and we are going to be covering homeowner rehab Tuesday, May 11th. Yeah. And next week we'll do down payment assistance for home buyer as well. So you get 2 weeks of home buyer.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Monty, anything else, or should I start on this section here?
I think I am all set, so it's over to you.
All right, thanks. All right, so we're going to move on to the third section. We're going to talk about buyer requirements and financing. We're going to cover a lot of the questions from the monitoring exhibit, and these questions pertain to home buyer. In particularly, we're going to talk about income determination, housing counseling, responsible lending, the buyer written agreement. Monty went over the developer written agreement. We're going to talk about the buyer written agreement, as well as resale and recapture. All right, so these requirements pertain to the eligibility of the home buyer. So the home buyers must be determined to be low income based upon the projection of their income. And so we're going to be looking for 12 months of projected income to determine if they're low income. The PJ has to be using one of the two definitions of income. This is the Part 5, Section 8, or the 1040 definition. Like I said, the buyer's household annual income has to be projected for 12 months. You need to be checking that against the applicable low-income limits. Those are published on the HUD exchange. We want to see documentation that you actually reviewed the income. Maybe you're using the income calculator it's available on the HUD exchange. That's a great tool where you input all that information and actually print out. You can print out whether they're income qualified or not. you want to be showing source documentation. And so what do we mean by source documentation? That's actual copies of a pay stub or unemployment compensation, maybe a letter from another income-based program such as Social Security or bank account statement. So you actually want to have copies of these in the file. You need to have in your policies and procedures which of those two definitions of income that the PJ decided to undertake, and that you actually did the calculations, compared it to the income limits, and decided that that household is actually income qualified. And I do want to point out that we are talking about household income, not just the owner, but the whole household. And then for compliance review down here, HUD is going to verify that for all buyers that the PJ is consistently following the definition that they identified in their policies and procedures, and that they're using the same definition for all buyers in that program or that particular project. So the next requirement is about homebuyer counseling. There's been a lot of buzz about homebuyer counseling this past couple of years. Each homebuyer must receive counseling that meets HUD standards. There was a delay in the housing counseling rule. There is still required that you do homebuyer counseling, but the actual requirements for that counseling has been delayed until August 2021. But hopefully you are starting to all implement those into your programs. If you're not familiar with what this is, you might want to check out the CPD Notice 18-9. Also, my colleague, Shauna Marai, who works on housing counseling, has done an amazing job putting things up on the HUD Exchange. They have a great presence there. So on the HUD Exchange, you can look under programs and then housing counseling, and that'll be a really good place for you to get more information about housing counseling. But what we want to see for our documentation in that file, we want to actually see that there is a certificate that the buyer went through a counseling program, that they actually have a certificate from a HUD certified counselor, or some type of documentation, if it's not a certificate, some type of documentation from that HUD certified counselor that they attended and that they received a number of hours, or if there was a test, whatever their program is set up, that there's some type of documentation. Also in the policy, the PJ's policy, you do want to start to identify that this counseling does need to be provided by a HUD certified counselor. So check back at the CPD notice and in the new regulations here to find more information out about that. So a PJ must have homebuyer programs and policies covering buyer underwriting, and Monty talked quite a bit about the buyer underwriting already, but also responsible lending and refinancing. And so for monitoring, we have to check to ensure that the mortgage loan is sustainable and it's not containing any risky lending features. So we want to make sure that what we're identifying in our policies and procedures, that the loan burden, that mortgage is sustainable. So we want to make sure we have sustainable front and back ratios. And then we want to make sure that our responsible lending policy is identifying risky loan requirements. So we want to identify what we are not, as a PJ, going to allow, because we think that these things are risky loan requirements. So we're not going to allow interest rates above the market, we're not going to allow high fees, we're not allowing balloon payments, and we're not going to allow mortgage life insurance. So we want to make sure that we're identifying these prohibited practices so that we can ensure responsible lending in our policies and procedures. And then for our documentation, we want to make sure that these are actually being followed. So we want in the policies and procedures, are they being followed? Are we making sure that none of these loans are falling into any type of risky types of loans? We also want to make sure that the ownership is sustainable, so we're meeting those ratios that we set up, and that there's no risky loan features as indicated in our responsible lending policy. So Monty did refer to this early on when he was mentioning the different regulatory requirements. So if a lender is under contract to administer the home down payment assistance, there are certain lender requirements that are put in place. And so 92254E, these are the actual requirements that are identified in 92254E. So there has to be a written agreement with terms of funding. So we want to identify what is that form of funding, is it a loan, is it a grant, what's the form, and the amount of homebuyer assistance, and are there any additional conditions put on that. So we want to make sure we have that. We want to have, make sure that the lender is charging reasonable fees, and we would identify those reasonable fees in the closing disclosure form. And then we also want to make sure that there's no fees that are being put over onto the buyer. So no fees to the buyer on home assistance. The PJ can pay for fees, but the buyer cannot be charged fees on the home assistance. And then we need to make sure that if the lender is running this assistance, that the PJ is verifying the buyer income eligibility. So that we're doing that whole income review. We're making sure we're using one of the two definitions of income. We're using source documentation, and we are inspecting the unit for compliance with home property standards. And we're doing this all prior to the lender providing assistance. And I know Monty showed us the property standards handout. I'm bringing this up here for you to see. So I'm on page 2 of this handout. This handout is available to you when you downloaded the slides. It was in the same place. So if somebody's buying new construction, or if they were purchasing acquisition, rehab, resale, here's the different property standards that need to be met. And the really nice thing about this is it also provides the documentation of what we want to see to ensure that it's meeting these property standards. So going back to our slides, working with our lender, we want to make sure we have a lender agreement in place, and it's identifying all these 3 things here in this lender agreement, that the income is that the buyer is actually low income. So we've verified that income. We have that documentation in the file. We have inspected the unit, so there would be an inspection form in there, as well as the closing form to make sure that there are no fees put onto the buyer for the home assistance. Okay, so now that we've reviewed the requirements for both the property and the buyer, we can move on to the home buyer written agreement. So Monty talked about the developer agreement, so let's focus on the home buyer agreement. There's just a few elements. It's not nearly as long as the developer agreement, but it's really super important that the information is there, that it's really clear, that the buyer actually understands what they are agreeing to. So in our home buyer written agreement, all these requirements at 92254A, we want to make sure that the price is identified, principal residence, that they actually understand that this needs to be their principal residence, where they're going to reside for the majority of the year. Most of our beneficiaries we work with, this is not typically an issue, but there are some people that work in some places where there's snowbirds. So it does need to be their principal residency during their period of affordability. That period of affordability could be a 5, 10, or 15-year period, depending on the amount of assistance that's provided. And then the resale or the recapture provision also needs to be in there. And we'll talk a little more about that on the next slide. The amount and the form of assistance that needs to be clearly identified, the time by which the housing must be acquired, any remedies for not meeting the principal residency. Typically this is, if we're notified, you have 30 days to move back in. If you don't move back in, then you're required to repay. So this would all be, you would work this out with your Office of General Counsel, and you want to make sure that whatever happens if they're not living there anymore as a principal residency would be triggered. So these, again, would be triggered by the resale or recapture provision. So you need to make sure you're following what those are as well. And then any refinancing guidelines. And we want to make sure that our refinancing guidelines are not containing any of our, we want to make sure that they're following our responsible lending policy as well. So our documentation, obviously, it's our written agreement, and we want to make sure that we have all these required provisions, as well as making sure the copy we have is dated and signed, both by the PJ and the buyer. So the next grouping of questions are about the resale and recapture provisions. So just to recap, resale requires that a fair return go to the seller and the unit must be resold to another low-income household during the affordability period. So your first buyer is low income. When that first buyer decides to sell, if it's during that 5, 10, or 15-year period, that first buyer is eligible to receive a fair return, and it must be resold to the subsequent buyer. The second buyer must also be low income. So that's what we consider resale. And then recapture, this is where, again, it's sold, the first buyer is low income in order to receive assistance through the home program, but they can sell it to anybody of any income. So recapture is that the home program is taking back or recapturing some or all of the available net proceeds that follow the PJ's recapture provision. So you want to make sure that you've identified what those resale or recapture provisions are, and then this needs to be identified and approved by HUD, and it's going to be in the consolidated plan and the annual action plan as well. And then this is imposed through the written agreement, and it's enforced with deed restrictions or covenants running through the land. And this part right here, well, HUD has to approve the resale or recapture provisions. If you ever wonder what HUD is using to look at that, I'm going to type in here, it's CPD Notice 12-003, and so that outlines the requirements for the HUD staff to review and approve a PJ's resale and recapture provisions. So what's our documentation for the resale and recapture provisions? Well, again, in that written agreement, and we're going to make sure that written agreement is complying with the approved resale recapture provisions. It has to have the correct period of affordability, and then the legal document that's enforcing the provisions really varies by the type, whether you're doing resale or recapture. So it would be a deed, a covenant for resale, or a mortgage and note for recapture. And then if resold, then the provisions are enforced, and if recaptured, then funds are returned. So again, it has to be consistent with the annual plan. It's HUD approved. So the monitor is going to want to pull out their annual plan or their comp plan and reference it to make sure that that language is the same and that there is documentation that these provisions were also approved by HUD. So there should be documentation in your file about that as well. Right, so the monitoring exhibits address a few administrative requirements. We're going to talk about procurement. This is if the PJ or the subrecipient is selecting the contractor. We're going to talk about project completion and record retention. So the monitoring exhibit includes one question on procurement and contractor oversight, and this is only applicable if the PJ or the state recipient or subrecipient is procuring the contractor. So if the PJ, subrecipient, or state recipient is procuring the contractor, then it triggers the procurement rules at 2 CFR 200 subpart D. This is under the post-federal award requirements. And HUD will use this Exhibit 34-3A, this is their guide for review for procurement, to ensure that this is being followed correctly. So what the documentation is, you want to make sure that you have procurement files. You'll probably want to go and look at 2 CFR 200. The procurement sections start around 200.317, and then they run, depending on if you're a state or what type of method of procurement you're following, runs anywhere from 317 to about 324. So if you're not familiar with those, you want to go back and look at 2 CFR Part 200 for those sections. Also want to let you know that 2 CFR 200 was updated last August. I know a lot of us were hunkered down, not really going anywhere, but if you missed it, they were updated. It did modify and recategorize the procurement area. So PJ should really check to make sure they're using the current version of 2 CFR 200 and make sure they're following any updated rules. Now let's take a look at project completion and what do we need to do for that. So the home projects must be completed within 4 years of commitment unless extended by HUD, and the homes must be sold under a ratified sales contract within 9 months of construction completion. And so what do we mean by project completion? Well, project completion means that the work is complete, the property is meeting the property standards, all the home funds have been drawn, and is reported as completed in IDIS. And so the documentation for this, we're going to look in IDIS. So IDIS, the data in IDIS is going to show that it was completed within 4 years of commitment. We're also going to look in IDIS that the completion is recorded in IDIS within 120 days of final draw. If it was not completed in 4 years, then this file should show that there was an extension approved by HUD or that the funds were repaid. And then we also want to have a ratified contract or a sale occurred within 9 months of completion. This is evidenced in the file by a final inspection or an occupancy permit. And if it was not sold, the file should have evidence that it was converted to rental or that the funds were repaid. So there are record retention or record keeping requirements. So for our homebuyer project records, these have to be retained for 5 years after project completion. Remember, project completion was that the work is complete, it meets property standards, and all the home funds were drawn, and it was considered completed in IDIS. So those records need to be retained for 5 years after meeting those conditions, and then the written agreement and the recapture and resale documents have to be kept for 5 years after the affordability period terminates. So if you have a project that has a 15-year affordability period, then you're going to be hanging on to those records for 20 years because we took the 15-year affordability period and we added 5 more years after the affordability period, which got us to 20 years, right? So our documentation, this is pretty obvious. You got to make sure the records are on hand for these time periods. So the project records, 5 years after completion, resale recapture, 5 years after affordability period, and the written agreement retained for 5 years after termination. So that termination of the affordability agreement, affordability period. So let's take a knowledge check and see what you think about this answer. So we're going to pull up a poll, and I need you to select the answer that you think is appropriate and then push submit. So which of these records do not need to be in the PJ's project files for the homebuyer program? So take a look and think what you think is the best answer. All right, so which of these records do not need to be in the PJ's project files for homebuyer program? Medora, what do we have for our answers here? Great, okay. So the correct answer, see if I get my pen to work here, is B, and almost all of you got it right, so great job, everybody. So the correct answer is B, homebuyer IRS tax returns for the last 3 years. Well, why is that? Well, that's because we are projecting income, right? So in order to project income, we don't want to look at the last 3 years. We want to look at income that's happening now and project that moving forward. Do we think that they're going to get a raise? Do we think they're going to have overtime? We're projecting our income. So we do definitely want to have our homebuyer application. We want to have our household size and the income. We want to have a copy of the deed restriction if we're doing resale. And we always need our written agreements between the PJ and the project developer. So the thing that we do not need is the last 3 years of our tax returns for our home buyer. Good job, everybody. All right, so now we're going to move into program design considerations. So we finished the regulatory compliance requirements, and we're going to look at bigger picture questions regarding the design or the strategies for your homebuyer development projects. So the PJ does need to make a lot of decisions about how they set up their design, how they operate their programs beyond the regulatory requirements, and they need to do this to be efficient and compliant. So we may want to consider a couple different big picture questions here, such as who is the program targeted to serve, and can your program be more administratively efficient and effective? And monitoring is a really good time to take a look at how your whole system is working. So in addition to verifying you're doing the right things, you also want to think about whether you're doing the right thing. So are you doing things right? You know, that's the monitoring, like we're checking the box, yes, we are taking income, yes, we're doing this, but are we actually doing the right things? Are we doing the things that are really needed in our community? If we set a program up 20 years ago, are those needs still the same? The way we set that program up, do people need more down payment assistance now? Do we need to hit some lower target areas? So these are some different things that we want to try to look at. So it's really helpful to evaluate whether your homebuyer development activities and strategies are meeting the intended objectives. And so some of the areas we want to discuss are you achieving the objectives you set in your consolidated plan? Remember, your consolidated plans, your 3 to 5 year plan. So you identify what those are. Are you able to meet those objectives the way that your program is currently set up and is being administered? Are you selecting the right projects? Is your underwriting resulting in the projects that are more sustainable? Or are you starting to find some of your homeowners in foreclosure? Are you able to use your develop agreements to monitor and enforce your requirements? Are you getting the type and the quality of homebuyer units that you want? Is your buyer financing affordable and ensuring sustainability? And are your resale and recapture provisions appropriate for your current market? So let's dive a little deeper into some of these. So this first one, the program objectives. So is your program meeting its goals? Have your program goals changed? Are there changes that are needed to staff or to operations to be more efficient or effective? So for our homebuyer development activities, what are we trying to achieve? Are we trying to increase home ownership among certain types of households? A lot of homebuyer programs are set up to target directly 65 to 80% AMI. Like they're usually ready and bankable. Is that how your program is set up? Do you want to try to target lower income levels? If you do want to target lower income levels, you might have to provide a higher subsidy to be able to make it meet those ratios that you want to set up. Are you targeting certain neighborhoods, or are there certain types of housing that you want to achieve? Are you doing infill housing where you want to have some new construction in there? Are you looking to do acquisition, rehab, resale? You want to figure out what type of housing do you want to put into place. And then are you having the intended effect that you are actually trying to achieve with your program goals? So in regards to project selection, are you selecting the right projects and doing the right underwriting to result in better projects? So over time, this is going to change, and so you might need to update your program design. Is there enough potential projects and developers to choose from? Do you have open enrollment, an open developer proposal time, or do you have a certain RFP where you only have it open for a month and a half and then you have a whole pool of things to choose from? So it really depends on the type of demand in your area and what's working and what could be more efficient. Has your market analysis helped to minimize unsold units? Are you able to sell those right away, or are you starting to run into some of the timeline and deadline issues? Are you able to adequately review the developer capacity, or have you been having performance issues because you haven't been able to do that? Does your staff have the right capacity or training to know what to review for both underwriting in addition to developer capacity? Your developer agreement. So this is another administrative focus that should be done. You know, there is a lot of risk that's done during the development period, and so does your written agreement allow you to enforce that if there's a problem during that development time? Do you have, are you actually able to record these during that risky time as well? Are you setting aside maybe a retainage, you know, for after every payment? Are you retaining a certain amount so that at the end, when there's a punch list, there's actually money worthwhile for the developer to come back and fix whatever needs to be fixed? So are you adding these additional things into your written agreement? Does it provide for verification of the use of home funds? So are you collecting reports, looking at project audits, cost verification? And do you have adequate control over the reporting and the disposition of sale, whether they're CHODO proceeds, if you're working with a CHODO and those funds are staying with the CHODO, or if it's program income that's being returned to you, the PJ, or the state recipient. We also want to perhaps put in this development agreement for them to be responsible for any marketing of the units. That will also help reduce having unsold, being able to minimize the unsold units. All right, so for costs and standards for the housing produced, let's talk a little bit about cost review and property standards and inspections. So for cost review, now the developer does not fall under the federal procurement requirements, so the PJ is responsible for conducting this review to determine that the costs are reasonable. So does your staff have the capacity to do that? Do they understand what costs are? Or do they need more training on that? For your property standards, are they sufficient to ensure the properties are sustainable for the buyer for at least the affordability period? Are their useful life standards sufficient? This is the useful life of major systems. You know, if our major systems are like our roof and our cladding, our plumbing, electrical. So are your useful life standards sufficient? For inspections, are these inspections being done frequently? Are you identifying any issues during the inspections? Are they meeting the specifications? Are they meeting all the property standards? And are these being documented properly as well? So looking beyond the requirements, you should evaluate the effectiveness of your policies to determine whether enhancements should be made. So 3 areas we're going to highlight are counseling. So we did talk about the housing counseling rules. So is the counseling effective in helping to ensure homeownership sustainability, or are you experiencing foreclosures on assisted buyers? Do your new buyers have sufficient training through this counseling to understand the obligations of homeownership and to avoid foreclosure? If they're buying a pre-78 unit, do they understand ongoing requirements, safety requirements? If there had been lead-based paint in the home, do they understand if they want to do any future work, how to do that safely for themselves, how to make sure they're maintaining any dust? For buyer underwriting and responsible lending, are your homebuyer underwriting standards helping to ensure sustainable ownership. So are those lending ratios that you put in place, are these sufficient to ensure that the buyer can afford their mortgage? Are your responsible lending policies ensuring that your buyers are obtaining reasonable and appropriate first mortgages? So it's up to us to help protect them on that, to review that against our responsible lending policies. For refinancing, are we making sure that all refinancing requests are being treated fairly, that we're helping to protect the home investment? Are you making certain that the refinance loan also meets your responsible lending standards as well? So lots of other things to think about to expand upon for your program policies and procedures. So you should also be regularly evaluating your resale and your recapture provisions. So the provisions that you put into place several years ago may no longer be appropriate for today's market. We want to make sure that you're having adequate control over your sales. So are these legal documents being recorded? Are they being stored for the period of affordability? That's what POA means. Are you monitoring for principal residency during the affordability period? My first job was working as a monitor for a city, so this was one of my jobs that I did, and one of the things we did is we were actually listed as a loss payee on the insurance, and so I got copies of everybody's insurance every year, and I always got notification from the insurance company when somebody moved or somebody sold their house. I mean, that's how I always found out that somebody was no longer in compliance, but that was one way that we checked. I know a lot of other communities will actually send a letter out, says, you know, please sign and return, certifying that you're still living there. All different ways to do that, but you want to make sure that you're monitoring that principal residency during that period of affordability. You also want to be notified when the units are being sold. And then, are your resale and recapture provisions achieving what you want? If you had resale in place, is this working? Is it helping to preserve the affordability, or is it starting to become a hindrance for the original home buyers? And like I said, are your current, looking at your current marketing conditions, are the resale or recapture provisions you put into place still effective, still meeting the goals that you had intended them to be? Monty, anything else you would add to some of these expansive areas before I move into preparing for HUD monitoring? You might be on mute, Monty.
I'm sorry, I was on mute and I couldn't get back up to the top of the screen. Go ahead, Les.
That's okay. Now, I was just wondering, before I dive into HUD monitoring, if there's any areas of these couple slides that you want to expand on.
Les, you had a comment. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say we've had a number of questions, and I think one of the keys here is on, particularly on underwriting, that each PJ is required to have policies and procedures on its underwriting, what its essentially definition of affordability is. And so those files are going to need to document that you followed those standards in sizing that level of assistance and determining whether this is a household that's eligible and can be assisted. And I'll just mention there've been a number of questions about income. And again, I just recommend folks go to eBuilding Home. Also, there is a income calculator on the HUD Exchange that can help you.
Great, thanks.
And I would just like to add the on underwriting, the key thing here for PJs to think about is there's really two stages that you're concerned with: the project and then the home buyers. And you've got to have policies at both levels. And a lot of times the focus, because of 92-254F, falls to just the buyer end of things, but the PJs have a substantial risk during the development phase, where they have provided money to a developer, and if the project does not get completed, the PJ is at risk. So making certain you've done the underwriting properly on the project before it starts is really important, and also thinking about the lien issues that exist in the interim from the time when you actually start providing the funding until there's actually home buyers at the end. It's a big risk period for PJs that they should not overlook.
And the documentation would reflect that process and its completion.
Right.
Great. Les, any other questions that have come up that we should mention before we jump into preparing for HUD monitoring?
I would just comment that we had a couple questions about home buyer counseling, and just reference that while it is required and will in the future be required with a HUD certified counselor and HUD certified counseling agency, the PJ can still put in place its standards on things like pre and post purchase counseling as part of that.
And there have also been some questions just come in on monitoring principal residency. Again, that is a requirement in the program, but the method of monitoring is not stated. Some communities have like local municipal water systems that have owner information that they can check that way. Others do not forward letters. Others have other methods of determining that somebody still lives there. If the method is up to the PJ to decide, but it should be part of their monitoring plan.
Great. Anything else? All right, well, we'll have time after this section to answer more questions as well.
Yeah.
So now we're going to talk about how to get ready for HUD monitoring. All right, so when HUD comes to monitor you, they might be monitoring several aspects of your home program depending on their risk analysis that they conducted as well as their monitoring plan. But this webinar is focusing on homebuyer development. So we're looking at 7-27. And like Monty said, it's a pretty lengthy exhibit, but it is available to you. You are able to access it. We had a link on a couple of our other sessions, but you can get to it through the HUD Exchange on the home program. When you go into monitoring and then tools, you can access this one. So the first step is really to assemble all the documents required for the review. And HUD uses 7-24 to prepare for their monitoring visit. And these are actually all the documents that you would find listed in 7-24. And so you want to pull these together. We've already talked quite a bit about your policies and procedures. You want to make sure you have your applications, any marketing materials, both hard copy as well as things that are available online. Another way to also look at your marketing materials, making sure that they're inclusive and reaching diverse populations. You want to look at your written agreement template, your resale recapture provisions, your underwriting guidelines, your rehab standards, IDIS reports. On our tool, we have a monitoring tool. Let me find it. Here we go. Okay, so on our monitoring self-assessment tool, this is on page 7. We list here because during every session, everybody says, what were those IDIS reports you guys mentioned? We actually have them listed here. This is the home monitoring assessment tool on page 7, and one of those documents that you can download. So you want to be checking your 27, the 35, as well as the open activities report, the PR 48. So just these are some IDIS reports that you can ask your IDIS people to download for you to have available. You want to have your most recent income limits, maximum subsidy limits, purchase price. You will also probably want, if you have projects that are a couple years old and HUD has asked to review some of those, you'll want to have the older limits too to ensure that those proper limits were used. Any past monitoring that's been done, I always like to look at that because then I can see have we fixed our problems, or are we still repeating the past? So you want to look at past monitoring, make sure that any issues have been identified and have been addressed and changes have been made. You want to look at any citizen input, were there complaints, were there kudos, if there were complaints and they were valid, were changes implemented, and how was that operationalized? Do we need to do more training for our staff? Did we have to change our program design? How did that citizen input affect the programs that we're administering? And then 727 is our actual checklist or exhibit that we're using for homebuyer development or rehab projects. So you want to do your document assembly. And then we want to move into our self-assessment. So remember, our self-assessment consists of 3 things. So we want to look at our policy and procedures. So we want to review those to ensure that they're complete and that they're compliant. We've gone through on the last couple slides of how can we expand on our policies and procedures in different areas, so different questions. You can ask yourself, you want to look at all the documentation, so you actually want to pull some files and perhaps use those exhibits and go through your files and make sure that you're able to check the boxes on all those required documentation items to make sure that you can show to HUD that you are compliant and following these requirements. And also answer these in advance of HUD monitoring to ensure that you're ready. So doing a self-assessment is really an integral part of your own monitoring plan. And we talked a lot about a monitoring plan and getting ready for monitoring and risk-based analysis. So if you missed that, we did that in the first session, Understanding Monitoring, and that is available on the HUD Exchange. I'm pretty sure that Medora put it in the chat, and we can probably put that back in the chat again if you did not see that. So go back to webinar 1 if you need more information on how to do a monitoring plan or how to do risk-based analysis. But self-assessment is really probably the key to making sure that you're ready before HUD comes to monitor. So different parts of conducting this self-assessment, we have the regulatory compliance. So under that regulatory compliance, you're looking at your policies and procedures. You want to make sure that your required policies and procedures are in place and that they're reflecting any additional program requirements that you put into place. Les mentioned that if you put additional requirements, you got to make sure you're actually following them. You want to make sure that your home buyer policies in place, such as your underwriting, your responsible lending, your refinancing counseling are being followed. You want to make sure that the administrative practices are being followed. For your written agreements, you want to make sure that those have all the required elements that are found at 92-504. You want to make sure that your written agreement with the buyer has all the required elements. Are there appropriate legal documents being used, and are they being recorded? Are they actually being followed? Are they enforced? You also want to have your regulatory limits and requirements reviewed. So are you using the proper homeownership value limit? Are you following and using the proper subsidy limits and income limits? Do you have your proper form of ownership that you're following? If you identified which form of ownership you're going to use in your policy procedures, are you actually following that? Are you calculating the affordability period properly? And are you following your resale or recapture provisions? And then for your eligibility documentation, is your home buyer eligibility documentation in the file? Are you having all your properties inspected? Is there proper documentation to show that it's meeting all the property standards? So in this middle area for the program performance, we're looking at our IDIS. We want to make sure that the information in IDIS is current, that it's up to date, that it's accurate. And we also want to look at our production versus our consolidated plan goals. So do the number of home buyers that we were able to assist match the consolidated plan or the annual plan goals? Are there any action items that we need to take as a PJ if our goals are not being met? So these are different self-assessment things for program performance. And then for monitoring and evaluation, Under our monitoring area, does the PJ have monitoring procedures for the homebuyer development projects? Are the monitoring documents, is the project monitoring documented in the file? For any previous monitoring, were there any homebuyer related findings in the previous monitoring and were they addressed? Were there any corrective actions that had to be implemented to prevent a reoccurrence? We also want to be looking at our citizen complaints and our comments. Has the PJ received comments or complaints from the citizens or the public or press or even on social media regarding our homebuyer activities? And if these concerns were valid, how did we address these? Did we make any changes? We want to look at our staff skills and our training. Does our staff have the capacity to undertake what we want to do? Do we need to send them to any training? Do we maybe need to hire or reorganize our staff to make sure we have proper staff with the right skills in place to make sure that our programs are being compliant and meeting all the requirements? And do we need to make any changes? Do we need to make any changes based on anything that we found or on the market, since the market's changed so dramatically over the last couple of years? Do we need to make changes? And how can we make sure that those go well and that we're able to do our self-assessment to ensure that those changes have made an impact on our program? Right, so let's review a couple of resources and tools that we have. So these should look familiar if you've been with us at a couple of our other webinars. So the red box is showing the Guide for Homebuyer Development and Rehab Projects and Procedures. That's the exhibit that we've been focusing on today. And then 7-24, this is what HUD uses, that's the green box. This is what HUD uses to get ready, and it shows what documents and reports that they assemble, but we also listed those in slide 57. And then if you need to access any of these exhibits, we did list the website there for you to be able to access those. This is the landing page on the HUD Exchange. So this is about middle of the page. You would go to the HUD Exchange and you would look under Programs, and then you would hit the Home program and you would come to the landing page, and this is about halfway down. And there are a number of different topic tiles, as we like to call them. There's a homeownership one. If you click on the homeownership one, this is what that page would look like there. We've also identified the monitoring tile for you as well. So lots of really good information and easy ways to get more guidance. We, myself included, referred people to this Building Home online training. It used to be a 2.5 in-person training, and then Les and I would do it for 4 weeks in a row as webinars, and we moved it over to a self-paced online training. Chapter 5 covers homebuyer programs. You do need to do a couple of foundational modules before they let you go to module 5, but I think that's really important because that'll give you the general basics. And we had quite a few questions from some people. I'm glad that you're here today, but I think you would really benefit from attending some of this Building Home online training just to get some a firmer foundation of the home program under your belt. A couple other tools that we've identified and talked about during this time period. If you download these slides, you can click on these links. It'll get you there. So we have the CPD, Community Planning and Development Notice 12003. This is the guidance on resale and recapture provisions. We have the CPD Notice 1809. This is the requirements for the homebuyer program policies and procedures. We have the self-assessment tool, as well as the property standards tool. And if you ever need technical assistance for the home program, or in particular need some help getting ready for HUD monitoring, there is a link here that you can get to from the HUD Exchange to request TA. And so that request will go to your HUD field office, and then your HUD field office will vet it and send it on to headquarters. There are technical assistance providers that may be able to assist you. All right, so Monty and Les, other questions that have come in or things that we should expand upon?
Well, we just got a question about the building home manual and whether there was any plan to update that, and I'm happy to report that that's currently being discussed now to do an update on that manual to be able to get that back out for folks. So yes, that's underway.
Great. Any other questions that have come up?
I noticed, Chris, there have been a number of questions I was scanning back through. A lot of things came up about period of affordability, length of period of affordability going longer and so forth. And I just want to remind people that HUD sets minimum periods of affordability based on the per unit assistance amount. You can always go longer. Just bear in mind that if you go longer, you are also extending your requirement to monitor and enforce that project, because the rule says the period of affordability shall not be less than that number. So it's always a trade-off. You're looking for longest term affordability, but remember that there's also an ongoing monitoring and enforcement obligation that exists with those longer periods. I also see a question came in about requesting TA and whether that's a red flag. And I know that TA is sometimes prescribed as a remedy when there are problems, but I tend to believe that proactive requests for help work in your favor in the long run, helping you to clean up things, and HUD knows you're trying to work on things. So I would hope it's not perceived that if you proactively request the TA, I hope it's not perceived as a red flag.
Great.
And one more question just came in: is it ever possible to retroactively shorten an affordability period? Because a lot of jurisdictions went with very long periods, not realizing what they might be bringing on themselves and their homeowners by going longer. To shorten a period of affordability, you have to work with HUD and get them to review and approve it, because it gets into questions of, do you get the right period of affordability relative to the assistance delivered and things of that nature. So you can't unilaterally do that, but work with HUD if you have a good case and documentation to be able to achieve it.
Yeah, especially if it's longer than what was originally needed and you're already past that time period. Working with HUD to show that.
Right.
Shouldn't be that difficult. I see somebody asking, is there going to be more advanced training for rental housing specialists or home regulation specialists? We'll definitely take these suggestions to HUD. We don't have anything planned right now. The monitoring is a little more advanced than basic home, but we completely understand your need for those of you who have been practitioners for many years looking for some more advanced topics. Yeah, we definitely hear you about that, and we will take that to HUD and let them know that that's what some people are looking for. Go ahead, Monty.
Chris, will there be an evaluation or survey that'll come out at the end that if folks have additional training needs that they would be asked in that?
I believe so. I don't know if they're doing them at one by one or if they're going to wait till the whole series is over and then send out. Usually it's a Survey Monkey that comes out from our logistical staff, and there's typically a place on there that if you are looking for certain topic areas or ideas about future training to do that. But if you need specific TA to your community, then this request TA and the HUD Exchange would be the appropriate method for you to be able to access that.
Chris, looking back through things, there were some resale recapture questions as well. We didn't really go into resale recapture here as its own topic. It's an important topic. I just want to stress or emphasize for people that Resale recapture methods, you have to declare them through your annual plan process, and the field office must explicitly approve your resale and recapture plan. So if you choose to change the method that you're using, you'll need to go through that process and get HUD approval in order to be able to change it. There is an older notice, CPD 1203, that goes into resale recapture and what's required in each of the elements. I know it's one of those things that HUD intends to update, but that's the guidance for us right now in looking at those methods.
Any other questions that have come in? Okay. Well, this is not the last time. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, Chris, that we will be coming back to this topic next Tuesday when we talk home buyer assistance. So if there are residual home buyer questions, we'll be back.
Yes. Yes. And I also had written into the Q&A because somebody was saying, well, I can't read all the questions and you're not going to post them. And I said, you know, check out the HUD Exchange. There's a lot of good topic areas there. And your HUD CPD field staff is also a good partner for you. So if you have a question, I know when I worked for a PJ, my HUD field staff used to say, please call me, that's why I'm here. And my boss never wanted me to call because he's like, oh, it'll be a red flag. But my HUD field rep used to say, please call me. I don't want you to spend hours trying to find an answer to something that I can tell you in 2 minutes. So please, you know, make sure you're reaching out to your HUD field staff and they're there as a partner to help support you because they want you to also feel confident and to be able to run compliant programs as well. All right, well, with that, Les and Monty, thank you for training and providing assistance today on the Q&As. Next week, we will be back again to do down payment assistance. That's what this home buyer assistance is. If you are doing any type of rental work, Les and I will be here on Thursday doing the first session of rental. So thanks for attending today, and we will see you again soon. So thanks, everybody.